Cale Henderson was contemplating the existential horror of his leftover tuna sandwich when the building's emergency lighting kicked in. The fluorescent strips above his cubicle flickered once, twice, then settled into an ominous amber glow that made everyone in the IT department look like they were auditioning for a zombie movie. "Great!" muttered his cubicle neighbor, Janet, stabbing furiously at her keyboard. "There goes my afternoon migration. These servers are more temperamental than my ex-husband." Cale pushed his glasses up his nose and squinted at his monitor, which was now displaying a lovely shade of nothing. 28 years old, and this was his life, troubleshooting network issues in a building that probably predated the internet. His mother had stopped asking when he'd find a real job and moved on to the more pointed question of when he'd find a wife. At this rate, he'd be married to his error logs. The elevator chimed somewhere behind the maze of cubicles, followed by the distinctive click of heels on linoleum. Expensive heels, by the sound of it. Kyle glanced up from his dead computer screen, mildly curious. Nobody important ever visited the IT floor. They just called and complained until someone fixed their problems remotely. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by what sounded like two other sets of boots. Heavy boots. Military boots, maybe. Cale's curiosity shifted into mild concern. Had someone finally snapped and called security on the guy who microwaved fish in the break room? "Excuse me." The voice was directly behind him now, smooth and oddly formal. "Are you Cale Henderson?" Cale swiveled in his chair, expecting to see corporate security or maybe a particularly aggressive sales rep. Instead, he found himself staring at three figures in what looked like motorcycle gear, complete with dark helmets that reflected the amber emergency lighting. The one in front was shorter than the other two, more slender, but something about her posture suggested she was definitely in charge. Yeah, that's me," Kyle said, trying to sound like he hadn't just been caught eating a questionable sandwich. "Can I help you with something? Because if this is about the printer on the third floor, I already told them it's not a network issue. It's possessed." The figure reached up and disengaged something on her helmet with a soft hiss. The helmet retracted in sections, folding back like metallic flower petals, revealing a face that made Cale's world tilt sideways. Blue skin. Not painted blue, not makeup blue, but genuinely, naturally blue, with an almost luminescent quality under the amber lights. Dark hair braided with silver threads, and ears, pointed ears that swept back elegantly from her temples. But it was her eyes that made his breath catch. Deep violet eyes that he remembered from dreams he'd convinced himself were just childhood imagination. "Hello, Cale," she said, and her voice carried an accent he couldn't place, something that made consonants sound like music. "It's been 15 years." The tuna sandwich fell from his numb fingers and landed on his keyboard with a wet splat. Around the office, conversations had stopped. Keyboards had gone silent. Someone's coffee mug hit the floor with a ceramic crash. Varaya? The name escaped his lips before his brain could catch up. It was impossible. She was impossible. She was... You remember? Something that might have been relief flickered across her features. Good. That will make this easier. Make what easier? Cale's voice cracked like he was 13 again. You can't be here. You can't be real. I mean, you were real, but you were... He gestured helplessly at her very obvious non-humanness. My parents said I made you up. Your parents underwent a standard memory modification procedure, Viraya said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. It was necessary for planetary security protocols. The procedure was less effective on developing minds. Janet was standing now, her mouth hanging open. Across the office, phones were ringing as people presumably called security, or their therapists, or possibly both. The two figures flanking Varela hadn't moved or spoken, but Kyle could feel their attention like a weight on his shoulders. "Planetary security?" Kyle repeated weakly. "What are you talking about? You're supposed to be my imaginary friend who lived in the woods. You're supposed to be the reason I spent half my childhood convinced aliens were real and got laughed at by every kid in school." "Aliens are real, Kale." Varela's expression was perfectly serious. "You're looking at one." "Yeah, I'm getting that now." He glanced around the office, where his co-workers were either staring in shock or pretending very hard to look busy, while obviously listening to every word. "Could we maybe discuss my apparent psychotic break somewhere more private?" "This isn't a psychotic break." Varela stepped closer, and Kyle caught a scent like ozone and starlight. "Though I understand your confusion, I've come to fulfill a promise." "What promise?" For the first time since removing her helmet, Varela's composure cracked slightly. Her violet eyes held something that looked almost like uncertainty. "You said you'd marry me." The emergency lighting chose that moment to flicker again, plunging them into brief darkness before the amber glow returned. In that instant of blackness, Kyle could have sworn he saw energy crackling between Varela's fingers. "I was 8, he said faintly. "Yes," she agreed, "but you still said it." The camping trip had been his father's idea of quality family time, which mostly involved Dad cursing at a portable grill while Mom tried to prevent Kale from wandering into the forest. 8-year-old Kale had different priorities, mainly involving the discovery of what he was convinced was a crashed UFO behind a cluster of pine trees. It wasn't exactly what Hollywood had taught him to expect. Instead of a gleaming silver disc, he'd found what looked like a really fancy motorcycle that had collided with a tree and lost. Badly. Steam hissed from various openings, and panels that should probably have been closed were hanging open like broken wings. "Hello?" he'd called out, because that's what heroes did in movies. "Is anyone hurt?" The response had been a groan from behind the wreckage, followed by a string of what sounded like very creative cursing in a language that made his ears tingle. Kyle had scrambled around the twisted metal to find a girl about his age, sitting against a tree trunk, holding her arm at an odd angle. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, even covered in dirt and what looked like glowing green engine fluid. Her skin was blue, not cartoon blue, but the deep blue of twilight skies, and her ears came to elegant points that swept back from her temples. When she looked up at him with eyes the color of violets, Kyle's 8-year-old brain had short-circuited. "Are you an elf?" he'd asked, because that seemed like the most logical question. "Ithrani," she'd corrected, wincing as she tried to move her injured arm. "And you're human, Homo sapiens, bipedal, probably about 7 to 9 years old based on your cranial development." "I'm 8 3/4, Kale had said with the dignity such precision deserved. "What's an Ithrani?" "What you'd call an alien, I suppose." She'd studied him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "You're not screaming or running away." "Should I be?" "Most species do. We're conducting a behavioral study of your people. From a distance, of course. Contact protocols are very strict." She'd glanced at her broken vehicle with what might have been embarrassment. This wasn't supposed to happen. Kyle had plopped down in the dirt beside her, fascinated. "What's your name?" "Varela." She'd pronounced it carefully, like she was teaching him something important. "What's yours?" "Kyle." "Are you hurt bad?" "My arm's broken. The emergency beacon is damaged, so my team won't find me for a while." She'd looked at him with something like hope. "Could you help me?" For the next 3 days, While his parents assumed he was playing elaborate games of imagination, Kale had smuggled food and water to Viraya. He'd helped her fashion a sling from his camp t-shirt and listened to stories about her homeworld that made his head spin with wonder. She'd taught him to say hello in Ithrani, which sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Your species is fascinating," she'd told him on the second day, carefully peeling an orange he'd brought her. "You're so young, but you show remarkable adaptability. Most adults would have reported my presence to your authorities by now. Why didn't you want me to tell my parents?" "Because they'd take me away, and I'd never see you again." She'd handed him half the orange, and he'd been struck by how human the gesture seemed. "Besides, this is more fun. It's like we're secret agents." "Secret alien agents," Kyle had corrected solemnly. "The best kind." On the third day, he'd brought her his favorite candy bar and asked the question that would apparently change both their lives. "Do you have boyfriends on your planet?" Viraya had blushed, which was fascinating to watch on blue skin. "We don't have boyfriends. We have bonding partners, but I'm too young for that." "What's a bonding partner?" "Someone you choose to spend your life with. Someone who completes your soul pattern." She'd looked at him with those violet eyes. "Like marriage, but deeper." "Oh." Kale had considered this with the gravity of someone who'd watched his parents argue about whose turn it was to take out the trash. "Maybe I'll marry you someday." He'd meant it as a joke, the kind of silly thing kids said when they were feeling particularly fond of each other. But Viraya had gone very still, her eyes widening. "You would want that?" "Sure," he'd said, grinning. "You're the coolest person I've ever met, even if you are blue." "Especially because I'm blue," she'd corrected. But she was smiling too. That night her rescue team had found them. Kyle had been awakened by a sound like thunder, but quieter, more controlled. Through his tent flap, he'd seen lights in the forest. Not flashlights, but something that made the trees glow silver. When he'd crept out to investigate, he'd found Viraya standing with 3 tall figures in equipment that looked like armor made of starlight. She'd turned when she saw him, and for a moment her composure had cracked. "I have to go," she'd whispered. "Will I see you again?" "I hope so." She'd touched his hand, and he'd felt a tingle like static electricity. "Remember what you promised." "What promise?" But she was already walking away, and the next morning his parents had found him talking to empty air about his imaginary friend. The doctors had said it was normal for children to create elaborate fantasies, especially during stressful situations like camping trips. For years, Kale had half believed them. But now, staring at Viraya's very real, very blue face under the amber emergency lighting, he realized that some promises were taken more seriously than others. "You thought I was joking," he said. "I thought you were making a formal betrothal declaration," she replied. "There's a difference." "A formal betrothal declaration?" Kale's voice climbed several octaves. "I was 8. I also declared war on vegetables and appointed my hamster as Secretary of Defense. That doesn't make Mr. Whiskers a cabinet member." Viraya's expression remained maddeningly calm. "Among my people, childhood promises carry the weight of cosmic law. When you spoke those words, you created a psychic bond that has influenced 15 years of interstellar politics." "Interstellar politics?" Kyle felt his brain starting to overheat. Around them, his co-workers were pretending to work, while obviously recording everything on their phones. Janet had pulled out a bag of popcorn from somewhere. "Look, I appreciate that you took my childish ramblings seriously, but surely there's some kind of alien statute of limitations." "There is not." One of Varea's silent companions finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. The compact of souls is binding across dimensional barriers. Oh, good, Kyle muttered. The sidekicks have opinions, too. Varea gestured to her companions. This is Commander Zephys, my military advisor, and healer Quill, who specializes in cross-species psychology. They're here to ensure the bonding ceremony proceeds without complications. Bonding ceremony? Kyle's chair squeaked as he leaned back. Nobody said anything about a ceremony. I thought we were just talking about how I accidentally proposed to an alien when I was a kid. The proposal was merely the first step, Quill explained, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone built like a small mountain. The formal bonding must be completed before your 29th birthday, or the psychic backlash will destabilize both our civilizations. My birthday's in 3 weeks, Kale said weakly. Yes, Varea confirmed. That's why we're here. Janet leaned over her cubicle wall. This is better than cable, she whispered loudly. Is the blue chick really going to marry our IT guy? The blue chick has enhanced hearing, Varea replied without turning around. And no, the situation is considerably more complicated than marriage. Kyle rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. Okay, let's pretend for a moment that I accept this insanity. What exactly happens if we don't do this bonding thing? Commander Zephys activated a device on his wrist that projected a holographic display above Kyle's desk. The image showed what looked like a galactic map, with pulsing red zones spreading across multiple star systems. The unfulfilled bond creates psychic resonance cascades, he explained with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly nasty plague. Your promise linked your life force to Princess Varea's soul pattern. If the connection isn't properly sealed, the resulting energy discharge will trigger madness across 17 different species. Princess? Kyle stared at Varea. You're a princess? Third in line for the crystal throne, she admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. I may have omitted that detail during our childhood conversations. Right, of course you're alien royalty. Why wouldn't you be? Kyle stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward into the printer. This is insane. I can't marry an alien princess. I can barely manage to marry my socks to each other in the laundry. The bonding process doesn't require traditional human marriage customs, Quill said helpfully, though it does involve a permanent psychic link, shared consciousness, and legal citizenship in the Ithrani Empire. Oh, is that all? Kale's voice was getting shrill again. What about my job? My apartment? My completely normal, boring human life? Your planet would be granted protected world status, Varea said quietly. Earth would become an official member of the Galactic Council. Your species would have access to technologies beyond your current comprehension. And if I say no? The hologram above his desk pulsed ominously. Galactic war, probable extinction of several civilizations, and your homeworld being quarantined until the psychic storms subside, Commander Zephys recited cheerfully. Estimated recovery time, 3,000 years. No pressure, Kale muttered. Varea stepped closer, and he caught that strange scent again. Ozone and starlight, and something that reminded him of summer rain. Kyle, I know this seems overwhelming, but I've spent 15 years preparing for this moment. I've studied your culture, learned your languages, even watched your entertainment broadcasts. You've been watching TV? Your comedy programs are fascinating, particularly the ones about workplace dysfunction. She glanced around the office meaningfully. Very accurate. Despite everything, Kale found himself fighting a smile. You've been studying human comedy? Among other things, I thought it would help me understand you better. She hesitated. I wanted our reunion to be pleasant. Well, you definitely win points for effort. Kale looked at the hologram, at Varea's hopeful expression, at his co-workers who were now openly staring like he was the best entertainment they'd had in years. Can I at least finish my workday? I've got 3 servers that are held together with prayer and electrical tape, and if I don't babysit them, the accounting department will lose their minds. The accounting department will lose their minds anyway when the psychic cascade begins, Commander Zephys pointed out. Right, but that's in 3 weeks. The servers might crash this afternoon. Varea's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. You're more concerned about your work responsibilities than the fate of galactic civilization? Lady, I've been in IT for 6 years. The fate of galactic civilization is probably in better hands. The government facility looked exactly like every secret base in every movie Kyle had ever seen, which somehow made it less intimidating and more surreal. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of industrial carpet that had given up on life sometime in the 1980s. So this is where they keep the alien stuff, he said, following Agent Morrison down a corridor lined with doors marked with things like Xenobiology Lab 3 and Interdimensional Quarantine, no food or beverages. This is where we keep the alien-adjacent stuff, Morrison corrected. The actual alien stuff is 3 levels down and requires clearance I don't have. What's my clearance level? Somewhere between walking disaster and diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Morrison stopped at a door marked Conference Room C and turned to face him. Just to be clear, Mr. Henderson, you're not under arrest. You're under protection. There's a difference. What kind of protection? The kind that keeps other alien species from kidnapping you to use as leverage against Princess Varea's people. Morrison opened the door to reveal a room full of very serious-looking people in very serious-looking suits. Also, the kind that keeps you from accidentally starting an intergalactic war by saying something unfortunate. I feel like there's a story behind that last part. There is. His name was Ambassador Peterson, and he's the reason we don't serve alcohol at first contact dinners anymore. Kyle was directed to a chair at the head of a long conference table, which made him feel less like a diplomatic asset, and more like he was about to be interrogated by a very polite firing squad. The assembled officials looked like they'd stepped out of a catalog titled Government Personnel Who Take Themselves Very Seriously. Mr. Henderson, began a woman with steel-gray hair and the demeanor of someone who ate international incidents for breakfast. I'm Director Walsh, and this is the Extraterrestrial Relations Committee. We need to understand the exact nature of your relationship with the Ithrani representative. You mean Varea? We mean Princess Virayathel Mindari Keth, third heir to the Crystal Throne, commander of the Silver Fleet, and keeper of the Eternal Flame. Walsh consulted a tablet. Also, apparently, your fiancée. She goes by Vareya, Kale said weakly, and we're not exactly— Mr. Henderson, interrupted a man whose nameplate read, Doctor. Reeves, Xenopsychology? Do you understand that your childhood interaction with the princess has created the first formal diplomatic bond between humanity and a major galactic power? I'm starting to get that impression, yeah. Do you also understand that 3 other alien civilizations have expressed concern about this development? Dr. Reeves made air quotes that somehow managed to look ominous. The Korthak hegemony has filed a formal protest. The Crystalline Collective is demanding territorial concessions, and the Void Singers have just started humming, which according to our xenolinguist means they're either very happy or planning to devour several solar systems. Maybe they're humming the wedding march? Kyle suggested hopefully. The silence that followed suggested this was not the right thing to say. Mr. Henderson, Walsh continued with the patience of someone explaining fire safety to a particularly slow arsonist, your betrothal to Princess Virea has made Earth a player in galactic politics. Congratulations. You've just made our entire species a target. Can I just apologize? Send a fruit basket? I'm really good at fixing things that are broken. This isn't a network outage, son. The voice came from the corner, where a man in a military uniform was studying what looked like tactical displays. This is more like accidentally proposing to the Queen of England and discovering that half of Europe wants to kidnap you to prevent the wedding. Has anyone actually asked Virea what she wants? Cale asked. Because she seemed pretty set on this bonding thing, but maybe she's just being polite. Dr. Reeves pulled out another tablet. According to our cultural analysis, Ithrani don't do polite when it comes to soul bonds. They consider unfulfilled promises to be a form of spiritual torture. Princess Virea has spent 15 years in what her people call bond sickness. Which means, think of it as cosmic homesickness, but instead of missing a place, she's been missing half of her soul. Dr. Reeves looked genuinely sympathetic. She's been waiting for you, Mr. Henderson. Her entire adult life has been shaped by a promise you made when you were 8. Cale felt something cold settle in his stomach. That's horrible. I had no idea. Which brings us to our current situation. Walsh activated a wall screen that showed a map of the local solar system, dotted with what looked like Christmas lights. Those are ships, Mr. Henderson. Ithrani ships, Korthak ships, ships from species we're still trying to identify, all of them here because of you. Are they here to stop the wedding or make sure it happens? Both, simultaneously. Galactic politics are complicated. A new voice cut through the tension. They're also irrelevant if the bond isn't completed properly. Kyle turned to see Virea entering the conference room, flanked by her 2 guardians. She'd traded her armor for something that looked more like formal diplomatic wear, but somehow managed to make government-issued conference room chairs look like thrones. Princess, Walsh said carefully, we weren't expecting you. I thought it was time Mr. Henderson understood what he's truly dealing with. Virea moved to stand beside Kyle's chair, and he caught that ozone and starlight scent again. The political ramifications are secondary to the personal ones. What personal ramifications? Virea met his eyes, and for the first time since their reunion, she looked uncertain. If we complete the bonding, Cale, you'll live for approximately 3,000 years. You'll develop telepathic abilities, limited matter manipulation, and perfect health. She paused. You'll also never be fully human again. And if we don't complete it, I die, she said simply. The bond sickness will consume what's left of my life force within the month. And then, yes, the psychic cascade will probably destroy several civilizations. The conference room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of someone's coffee maker gurgling in another office. So, Cale said finally, no pressure at all. The Ithrani transport ship looked like someone had taken a swan, crossed it with a fighter jet, and then asked an artist with serious commitment issues to redesign it. Cale stood at the boarding ramp, clutching a duffel bag that contained everything he'd managed to grab from his apartment before Agent Morrison had politely informed him that staying on Earth wasn't really an option anymore. You know, he said to Virea, who was performing some kind of pre-flight ritual that involved touching glowing panels in a specific sequence, When I imagined my first trip to space, it didn't involve potentially preventing galactic genocide. Most people don't get such an exciting introduction to interstellar travel, she replied, her fingers dancing across the controls. Consider yourself fortunate. Right, fortunate. Kyle watched as Commander Zephys secured what looked like enough weaponry to level a small city. Quick question. Are we expecting trouble? Or do you always travel with enough firepower to vaporize a moon? Both, Zephys said cheerfully. The Korthak have deployed 3 battlecruisers to intercept us before we reach the council ship. Standard diplomatic protocol. Their idea of diplomacy involves battlecruisers? The Korthak idea of diplomacy involves ritual combat, territorial dominance displays, and really aggressive poetry, Varela explained. The battlecruisers are actually quite restrained. Healer Quill looked up from a device that was scanning Kale's bio-readings. Your stress levels are elevated, but within acceptable parameters. How are you feeling about the transformation process? You mean the part where I become partly alien and live for 3,000 years? Or the part where if something goes wrong, several civilizations cease to exist? Both. Well, on the plus side, I'll never have to worry about my student loans again. Kiel settled into what he hoped was a passenger seat and not some kind of ejection mechanism. On the minus side, I'll have to explain to my mother why her grandchildren are going to have pointed ears. Actually, Varela said, engaging what sounded like the galaxy's most sophisticated engine, Athrani-human bonding doesn't typically result in offspring with mixed physical characteristics. The genetic integration is more subtle. More subtle? How? Your children will look human, but possess extended lifespans and enhanced cognitive abilities. Think of it as evolution with better benefits. The ship lifted off with surprising smoothness, and through the transparent aluminum viewport, Kale watched Earth shrink to a blue marble, then to a point of light, then to nothing at all. The view was replaced by a star field that looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. First time leaving your home planet? Quill asked, noting Kale's expression. First time leaving my home state, actually. I was supposed to visit my cousin in Denver next month. Kale stared at the stars. I should probably call and cancel. Interplanetary communication is available, Varela said, though there might be a slight delay. How slight? 47 minutes each way. Right, I'll send a text. An alarm chimed softly, and Zephys's expression shifted from cheerfully homicidal to professionally concerned. We have company, 3 Korthak vessels, approaching fast. Are they here to stop us or escort us? Kyle asked. With the Korthak, there's not much difference. Varela's hands moved across the control panels with practiced efficiency. They believe that any diplomatic proceeding worth having is worth fighting over. The main view screen lit up with the image of what could only be described as a floating city designed by someone with serious anger management issues. All spikes and glowing red sections, it looked like it had been built specifically to intimidate anyone who saw it. A Thrani vessel, a voice boomed through the communication system, speaking what sounded like English filtered through a cement mixer. Prepare to be boarded for diplomatic consultation. Translation? Kyle asked. They want to kidnap you and hold you hostage to prevent the bonding ceremony, Zephys explained helpfully. Standard Korthak negotiation tactics. And our response? We politely decline and prepare for evasive maneuvers. Varela opened a communication channel. Korthak Command, this is Princess Varela Thel. We appreciate your concern for galactic stability, but we must respectfully continue to our destination. Translation of that? I told them to go away, or we'll blow up their ships. The Korthak response was immediate, and involved what sounded like very creative cursing in at least 3 different languages, followed by weapons fire that lit up space around them like a deadly fireworks display. "Hang on!" Varaya called out, and the ship banked sharply to starboard, throwing Kale against his safety restraints. "This is your idea of diplomacy," he shouted over the sound of energy blasts hitting their shields. "This is foreplay," Zephys replied, returning fire with enthusiasm. "You should see what happens when they're really upset." The next few minutes were a blur of impossible maneuvers, flashing lights, and Kale discovering that he had a much stronger stomach for space combat than he'd expected. Either adrenaline was a hell of a drug, or the bond with Varaya was already affecting his physiology. "Got them!" Zephys announced, as the last Korthak ship spun away trailing debris and what looked like very offended sparks. "Did we just start a war?" Kale asked. "No, we just participated in traditional Korthak diplomatic discourse," Varaya said. "They'll file a formal complaint, demand reparations, and probably send us a gift basket." "A gift basket?" "Filled with weapons and poetry. It's their way of saying, 'Well fought, we respect your commitment to your cause. Please don't vaporize our homeworld.'" Kyle stared out at the stars, which had suddenly seemed much more hostile. How much weirder is this going to get? "Well," Varaya said thoughtfully, "we still have to convince the High Council that our bond is genuine, avoid 3 assassination attempts, and participate in a ceremony that involves temporarily merging our consciousness. Anything else? There's a 50% chance the ritual will be interrupted by time-traveling pirates." Time-traveling pirates? It's a Tuesday. They always attack on Tuesdays. The Ithrani High Council chamber looked like someone had crossed a cathedral with a spaceship and then asked a committee of architects to make it more intimidating. Crystalline spires stretched toward a ceiling that showed real-time images of distant galaxies, while representatives from dozens of species occupied floating platforms arranged in concentric circles around a central dais. "So," Kale whispered to Varaya as they approached the ceremonial platform, "on a scale of 1 to completely terrifying, how badly can this go wrong?" "Well, if the ritual fails, we both die horribly and take most of known civilization with us," she replied with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "But if it succeeds, you'll have to learn 17 different diplomatic protocols and remember not to accidentally insult anyone's ancestral spirits." The ancestral spirits thing seems like the bigger challenge, honestly. High Counselor Thane, who looked like he'd been carved from living starlight, raised his staff for silence. "We gather to witness the completion of a soul bond forged in innocence, tested by time, and now threatened by the machinations of those who would use it for their own ends." "No pressure," Kale muttered. The ceremony began with what could only be described as cosmic paperwork. Formal declarations, binding oaths, and enough legal terminology to make a lawyer weep with joy. Kale found himself wondering if this was how all galactic civilizations handled marriage, or if the Ithrani were just particularly fond of bureaucracy. "Do you, Kale Henderson of Terra, accept the bond freely and without coercion?" Counselor Thane intoned. "I do, but I'd like it noted for the record that this whole situation is completely insane." A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through the assembled delegates. Even some of the more intimidating species seemed to find his honesty refreshing. "Do you, Varaya Thel Mindari Keth, accept the completion of this bond, knowing that it will link your destinies across space and time?" "I do," Varaya said simply, but her violet eyes held depths of emotion that made Kyle's heart skip. Then let the bonding commence. What followed was unlike anything Kyle could have imagined. It wasn't the searing pain he'd expected or the mystical transcendence he'd seen in movies. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a missing piece of himself he hadn't realized was gone. Varea's thoughts touched his, not invasively, but like a gentle handshake between minds. "Hello again," her mental voice whispered. "Hi yourself," he thought back, and was surprised by how natural it felt. The physical changes were subtle, but immediate. Colors became more vivid. Sounds gained harmonic overtones he'd never noticed, and he could feel the life forces of everyone in the chamber, like warm lights in the darkness. "The bond is sealed," Counselor Thane announced, and the assembled delegates erupted in what Kyle assumed was applause, though it sounded more like a symphony of wind chimes, whale songs, and what might have been very polite roaring. "So that's it?" Kale asked. "We're officially bonded?" "For the next 3,000 years, give or take a century," Varea confirmed. "How do you feel?" Kale considered the question seriously. The terrified IT technician who'd been eating a questionable tuna sandwich 3 days ago felt like a distant memory. In his place stood someone who could sense the quantum fluctuations in the chamber's energy fields, and somehow knew the names of 17 different types of FTL drive. "Different," he said finally. "Good different, but definitely different. Also, I think I can taste colors now." "That's normal. It wears off after the first century." "Great. Something to look forward to." The celebration that followed involved enough exotic foods to stock a small restaurant, entertainment that defied several laws of physics, and toasts in languages that hadn't been spoken on Earth since before humans developed written communication. Kale found himself actually enjoying it, despite being the center of attention from beings that looked like they'd stepped out of a fever dream. "You've adapted well," Commander Zephys observed, appearing at Kyle's elbow with a drink that sparkled like liquid starlight. "Most humans require significant psychological adjustment periods. Most humans don't spend their childhood befriending alien princesses," Kale replied. "I had a head start on weird." "What will you do now?" Healer Quill asked. "Earth needs an ambassador, and you're uniquely qualified." Kale looked across the chamber at Varea, who was engaged in animated conversation with what appeared to be a sentient crystalline formation. Through their new bond, he could feel her joy, her relief, and underneath it all, a contentment he hadn't realized she'd been missing. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm going to learn how to be a diplomat, and maybe figure out how to explain to my mother that her son is now technically alien royalty." "That should be an interesting conversation," Quill noted. "You have no idea. She's been trying to set me up with her book club friends for years. Wait until she finds out I married a princess from another galaxy." 3 hours later, as the celebration wound down and various delegates departed for their respective homeworlds, Kyle and Varea found themselves alone on an observation deck overlooking the vast expanse of space. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling beside him on what passed for a bench. Kyle considered the question. A week ago, his biggest concern had been whether the coffee machine in the break room would survive another day. Now he was bonded to an alien princess. Earth was a member of the Galactic Council, and he had a lifespan that would let him see the birth and death of stars. "You know what?" he said finally. No regrets. This is terrifying and wonderful and completely insane, but it's also the best thing that's ever happened to me. Even though you'll never be fully human again? I was never very good at being fully human anyway." He took her hand, marveling at how right it felt. Besides, someone has to make sure Earth doesn't accidentally start any more galactic wars. Might as well be the guy who started this one. Berea laughed, the sound like silver bells in a gentle breeze. I love you, Kyle Henderson. I love you too, Princess Berea Thel, etc., etc. Even if you did take 15 years to come collect on a promise? I wanted to make sure you were ready. For what? For everything. She gestured at the stars, the ships, the infinite possibilities spread out before them. For this. Hale squeezed her hand and smiled. Yeah, I think I am.